Today we are going to talk about a tool called the long tail. To give credit where credit is due, this work stems out of an article that Chris Anderson wrote in the Wired magazine around 2004. But the work actually really relies on mathematical research that have been done over the years at many places. But let's go all the way back to the Renaissance period, and let's examine a principle called the Pareto principle. Many of you might have heard of the Pareto principle, and those of you who don't think you have heard of the Pareto principle, you actually have, you just don't know it by the name. You might have heard of it as the 80-20 rule. Well, it's actually called the Pareto principle. It goes back to a guy by the name of Pareto. During the he was a Venetian during the Renaissance time, and he found that 80% of the wealth in Venice was held in the hands of 20% of the Venetian families. He thought this was quite surprising. 80% of the wealth of Venice in the hands of 20% of the families. He thought that was quite surprising. Well, come to find out, over the years, we've all come to find out that comment is probably true about everything you think of. 80% of the faults come from 20% of the places, 80% of errors come from 20% of the people. It's true in many, many situations. People who do quality analysis know that very well. It has come to be known as the Pareto principle. And yet, in some situations, the Pareto principle doesn't apply. This is where Zip found that in some situations, it is almost the antithesis of Pareto principle, and he created something called Zipf's law. A good example of Zipf's law is in the frequency of words in an English text. If you were to take a voluminous English writing, let's say the Shakespeare, and you were to do a frequency count of all the words appearing in this book, you'd obviously find some words very, very frequent. Maybe in English, the word a, the word the word an, these things might be very frequent. And if you do a histogram, you'll find that it rapidly drops. In fact, what Zip observed is that the 10th letter, the 10th word, would occur half as frequent as the first word, and the 100th word would occur half as frequent as the 10th word. It would logarithmically drop down, and yet there will be thousands of words out there. Interestingly enough, if you add up the 10 most frequent words or the 100 most frequent words, you still haven't gotten a good part of the total number of words. Now, why is this important to people in business? Well, there are markets. There are markets that behave in that fashion. That's what Chris Anderson pointed out. These markets are said to have a long tail. These markets have the property that if you look at the products in this market, here are the products in this market, and this is the frequency with which the product is desired in the market, meaning the number of people who want that particular product. And if you do a histogram where you write the high frequency items first, this has the behavior of Zipf's law, what he called the long tail. In other words, if you look at the first 20%, this portion does not include the majority of the space. This area here still has a significant amount of area under the curve. Let's see what examples of such markets. If you go to your local bookstore, if you're maybe a Borders or Barnes and Noble, if they still exist, or your local bookstore down the corner, or if you're in Canada, Chapters, your local bookstore is likely to carry about 10,000 titles. 10,000 titles. Now, in the English language, there is about 1 million volumes, million titles out there, books, 1 million different books, and yet the local bookstore can carry maximum about 10,000 titles. So where do you find the other 990,000 titles? Well, you don't. Till about 20 years ago, you couldn't get it. And then came Amazon. What did Amazon do? In fact, when Amazon went public, they specifically positioned themselves as, we are not competing with Barnes & Noble and Borders. Tell that to the Barnes & Noble and Borders people now. They specifically said, we are selling all those books that nobody else will sell, because there is a long tail, 990,000 books, that somebody wants, not much demand, but there's a large volume from which you can create a massive market. That is called a long tail. What are some other examples of such long tail markets? Well, Netflix. Netflix figured that while your local Blockbuster, again another defunct company, a local Blockbuster could carry a certain number of titles in terms of movies, there is a long tail in the movie industry in terms of the products available. The number of movies made is significantly larger than any bricks and mortar place could carry. Netflix provides that solution. There's an interesting company in London, Ontario, StarTech. They provide electronic connectors for various electronic connections. You know, if you wanted a 3-pin this to a 6-pin that, with a cable that's 12 feet long, and a male this and a female that, they've got that very specific cable that you might need. Now, if you go to your local Radio Shack, how many such cables would you find? Maybe a dozen, maybe 20, maybe 30. But there's literally hundreds, if not thousands of them that people have a need for. Again, has a long tail. StarTech capitalizes on that long tail. There are many different markets that have a long tail. If you, in your business, in your own markets, if you can identify a long tail that otherwise might not have been served before, because in the old days there was no way to serve long tails, but now that we have new technologies like the internet and the distribution capabilities, if you can identify a long tail that could be served with the new technologies, you might find that you can create a new market. For example, look at the number of hotels that are there. Well, all of a sudden, I'm sure you saw, the hotels you thought of was your Marriotts and your Hyatts and your Fairmonts and your Deltas and your Hiltons and the Sheratons. But those hotels make up only a small fraction of the total number of beds available. There is a long tail of bed and breakfast places in every town all over the world. Again, a long tail. Ask yourself, is there a long tail in the market you serve? Can you capitalize on this long tail with the new technologies that are available? Long tail.